Where are you in the storm? In the chaos, can you hear our desperate call?
Hello and welcome to day 5 in our series Navigating the Storm, drawn from the Apostle Paul's tumultuous journey to Rome and taken from the book of Acts and chapter 27. Today's passage is fairly lengthy. Acts chapter 27, verses 13 to 26. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island named Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed." Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So, keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." As I said yesterday, one of the things I try to do in various ways is to ask God to direct my various ways, to acknowledge him in all my ways, that he might direct my path. We all have ways. I want God to lead mine. I want him to direct my ship. So in some ways, I ask him to do that. In that sense, there are times when I want God to be the captain of my ship. But on one level, I am not sure he will do that, because I am not sure that is how God works. I should probably explain what I mean. The way I believe God might work, and I could be wrong, is that for the most part, God will not be the captain of your ship. God will not be the captain of your ship because that's not his job. That's your job. It's your ship. God will not take the wheel. Your life is not God's responsibility, it's yours. God has given that responsibility to you. I think that is how I see things. As you may or may not know, one of my favourite parables attributed to Jesus is called the parable of the talents. You probably know the story. There is a boss. He gives 3 members of his team responsibility for investing a certain amount of money. He goes away and he leaves them to it. And then when he returns, he holds them accountable for how they handled their responsibility. I believe that one of the responsibilities that the boss hands to us is the responsibility for what we do with our own lives. Speaking on the topic of responsibility, the Christian author and psychologist Dr. Henry Cloud says this: "It is one of the most liberating and powerful, freedom-giving, opportunity-making success drivers that exists. It is like fuel for getting better if we have a love affair with responsibility." I don't know how many of us would say that we do love responsibility. But if we take responsibility for the condition and the direction of our ship, then we are more likely to begin to make it better. And if we don't, perhaps no one else will. You will have to steer that ship, and if you don't steer it, perhaps it will just drift along, or be moved here and there by the winds and waves of the circumstances of life. Or maybe someone else will take hold of the wheel of your life and you will be led primarily by the decisions of other people. But the ship of your life is not their responsibility either. It's yours. And there are times when we must take the wheel, accept we are in a storm, and face up to the responsibility for steering ourselves out of it, or at least through it. So in that sense, there are times when we are captain of the ship. And to extend the ship metaphor a bit further, although God may not steer the ship because that's your job, I do believe that, as we looked at earlier in the week, he can and sometimes does desire to issue instructions. Perhaps he drops a thought, an idea, a sense of direction into our hearts and heads. But in that sense, he is not acting as the captain of the ship. He is operating at a level higher than that. Perhaps the admiral of the fleet. However, sometimes, whether we like it or not, perhaps there are times when we are not at the wheel and God is not at the wheel. Like Paul, in the passage I read from today, perhaps there are times when we are like passengers on somebody else's ship. Perhaps there are times when where we will go will depend on the decisions others make and how they steer. When you are a kid, it is very much the case that we are like passengers on somebody else's ship. They tell us what to do and where to go. The parent is at the wheel. And like Paul, we may or may not agree with the course that others want to take us. And like Paul, we may say so. And like Paul, we may not be listened to. And like Paul, we may have to deal with the facts as they are, as frustrating as they may be. But in a sense, there are times when others will be the captain of the ship. Maybe a boss, maybe a family member, maybe somebody else. And what I think is one of the unavoidable realities of life is that sometimes, like Paul, we are taken into storms by somebody else. We are led into storms by somebody else. It very much seems to me that God has designed life in such a way that the decisions others make and the way they steer their ship can bless and benefit us. But also, the decisions others make and the way they steer the ship can cause us to struggle and to suffer. Finally, though, what I would like us to take note of in today's passage is the attitude displayed by Paul. He knows that the storm is not his fault, and he knows this storm would have been avoided had his warning been heeded. Yet his words to the frightened crew, including those who led him into this, are gracious and encouraging. Well, may God help us to deal with people in such a way, whoever we think is holding the wheel right now.